The room went quiet as Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped up to speak. She was ready to show her proof about voting rights violations. But Senator Ted Cruz had other plans. Right after she started, he jumped in with a procedural objection. Everyone watched as Cruz, with a smirk on his face, looked ready to take over the session. What happened next shocked everyone. Cruz thought he could bully this new legislator, but Crockett was prepared. He interrupted her about 6 times in the first 10 minutes, each time more aggressive than the last. But Crockett wasn't having it. When Cruz tried to silence her again, she hit back with words that left everyone speechless and turned his own tactics against him. Before we get into this crazy showdown, hit that like button if you want more stories like this, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the action in Congress. Now watch how a brand new congresswoman from Texas took down one of the most seasoned politicians in D.C. The session was supposed to be normal. The Committee on Legal Matters was there to talk about new voting rules. Crockett, in her first big meeting, was presenting research she'd been working on for months. She looked sharp, her papers were organized, and she spoke with confidence. She'd practiced this speech a lot. But Ted Cruz was watching from across the room, arms crossed, with that scheming look he always has. The Texas senator has built his career on moments like these, spotting young liberals and making an example of them on camera. At 53, Cruz is known as one of the sharpest legal minds in the Senate, someone who can tear apart arguments with precision. Crockett was everything Cruz loves to target: young, passionate, and representing a state that's gone from red to purple. At 33, she's exactly the kind of forward-thinking person Cruz makes a living fighting against. She was a human rights lawyer before getting elected, but committee hearings aren't courtrooms. This was Cruz's turf. As Crockett began her opening remarks about voting restrictions, Cruz leaned forward. He's done this a million times before. Wait for the perfect moment, interrupt with a technical question, throw the speaker off balance, and then control the conversation. It's a strategy that's worked on countless progressive politicians over the years. The cameras were rolling. The room was packed with aides, reporters, and advocacy groups. This was exactly the kind of high-pressure situation that can make or break a political career. Cruz knew it. Crockett knew it. Everyone in the room could feel the tension building. Ted Cruz sat at the committee table like a hunter sizing up his prey. He's got that fancy law degree on his resume. He was Texas's Solicitor General, giving him the kind of courtroom confidence that's intimidated a lot of witnesses. He's argued cases before the Supreme Court, written best-selling books, and run for president. In his mind, taking on a freshman congresswoman should be easy work. Cruz has built his whole political identity on these kinds of situations. He's the conservative who can outsmart anyone, the legal expert who can find the flaw in any argument, the experienced politician who knows how to use the rules to control the narrative. His supporters love watching him tear down liberal arguments on TV. But what Cruz didn't realize was who he was up against. Jasmine Crockett didn't just stumble into Congress. She spent years as a human rights lawyer fighting cases in Texas courts, defending clients against some of the most powerful legal teams in the state. She's won cases that everyone said were impossible to win. Crockett grew up in the Midwest, got her law degree in Texas, and spent years fighting voting restrictions long before she ever thought about running for office. She's faced hostile judges, aggressive opposing lawyers, and courtrooms full of people who underestimated her because of her age and appearance. The stakes in this hearing couldn't be higher. The voting rights law they were discussing could affect millions of people across the country. But beyond that, this was about power. Cruz represents the old guard, the established politicians who've run these committees for years. Crockett represents a new generation of leaders who aren't willing to be silenced or intimidated. The voting rights bill is on the table, aiming to make early voting easier, improve monitoring at polling places, and stop voter intimidation. Cruz sees this as everything wrong with the government getting too involved. For Crockett, it's about protecting the right to vote, which is key to democracy. Cruz had already said he would expose the extreme agenda behind the bill. He investigated Crockett, digging into her past and finding what he thought were weaknesses in her legal arguments. He saw this hearing as a chance to score political points against the progressive wing of the Liberal Party. But Crockett was ready too. She had studied Cruz's tactics, watched him in past hearings, and knew how he operated. She knew he would try to cause trouble, throw her off balance, and turn the session into a debate about basic principles instead of the real problems with voting restrictions. Tension was high as both sides prepared for a fight. Cruz's staff had pointed out possible flaws in the liberal arguments. Crockett's team had prepared responses to every possible attack. The press was set to capture every moment of what was sure to be a heated showdown. What neither side fully expected was how personal things would get, and how quickly Cruz's usual tactics would backfire against someone who had spent years preparing for this exact type of battle. Crockett had barely started her opening statement when Cruz jumped in. "Point of order, Mr. Chair," he said, his voice cutting through her words like a knife. "I think the witness is misrepresenting the legal precedent she's citing. It was classic Cruz, technically within the rules, but clearly designed to throw Crockett off her game." She paused, looked straight at Cruz, and calmly replied, "If you'll let me finish my remarks, I think your concerns will be addressed." But Cruz wasn't done. He leaned into his microphone, a familiar smirk spreading across his face. "With all due respect, delegate, accuracy is important in these hearings. We can't let incorrect statements of law go unchallenged, even if they support our particular political narrative." The room buzzed with tension. Aides looked up from their notes. Reporters leaned forward. This was exactly the kind of conflict that made headlines. Crockett took a breath and continued her statement, citing statistics about polling place closures in Texas. She had gotten through just 2 sentences when Cruz interrupted again. "Point of order," Cruz said, his voice more forceful this time. "The information the delegate is presenting seems to be incomplete. Are we supposed to make policy decisions based on selective data?" This time, murmurs spread through the room. Even members of Cruz's own party shifted uncomfortably in their seats. 1 interruption might be seen as valid oversight. 2 was starting to look like harassment. But Crockett remained calm. "Mr. Cruz, I appreciate your interest in the data. I have the full report and sources available if you'd like to review them after I've finished presenting the evidence." Her composure seemed to irritate Cruz. He had expected her to get flustered, lose her train of thought, and give him an opening to take control of the hearing. Instead, she was handling his interruptions like a pro. Crockett moved on to discussing voter intimidation tactics, presenting case studies from recent elections. She was gaining momentum, her voice growing more confident with each point. The evidence she was presenting was damning, showing clear patterns of suppression targeting specific groups. That's when Cruz made his 3rd interruption. "Mr. Chair, I must object to the characterization of legitimate ballot security measures as intimidation. This kind of inflammatory language has no place in a serious policy discussion." Now the room was getting awkward. 3 interruptions in 5 minutes exceeded normal hearing protocol. Some members were starting to exchange glances. The chairman looked like he was considering stepping in, but Cruz was just getting started. As Crockett tried to present evidence about voting monitoring, he interrupted a 4th time. "Point of order. The delegate seems to be conflating voting observation, which is legal and necessary, with voter intimidation, which is illegal. This distinction is important." Crockett's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Cruz, voting observation is certainly legal. Voter intimidation is not. The evidence I am presenting clearly distinguishes between the two." The 5th interruption came as Crockett was discussing federal oversight systems. "Mr. Chair," Cruz said, his voice now dripping with condescension, "I think we need to clarify the basic limits on federal power here. The delegate seems to be advocating for federal overreach that would infringe on state sovereignty." By this point, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. What had started as a policy hearing was turning into a personal battle. Cruz kept interrupting, and it was getting annoying. Crockett's supporters were clearly ticked off. Even some conservatives looked uncomfortable with Cruz's behavior. The 6th interruption was really something. As Crockett was about to share her final points, Cruz slammed his hand on the desk and shouted, "Point of order. This whole thing is just a show to justify the national government taking over local elections. We can't let this hearing be used to change everything." The room exploded. Liberals demanded order. Conservatives seemed unsure what to do. The chair tried to calm things down, but everyone was staring at Crockett, who stood at the podium with her papers, her face unreadable. She'd been interrupted 6 times in 10 minutes. Cruz's aggressive tactics had messed up her presentation. Anyone else would have been shaken, confused, totally thrown off. It was obvious to everyone that this was a planned attack. Cruz had systematically derailed any chance of a real discussion, turning what should have been a policy debate into a display of his own ego. It was so obvious that even neutral observers were starting to wonder if this was real oversight or just political harassment disguised as a review. You could see the strain of the constant interruptions in Crockett's tense expression and the way she was clenching her jaw, but what you couldn't see was how ready she was for this. Years of experience had taught her that aggressive opponents often show their weaknesses when they get too confident. Cruz's growing aggression suggested he was sticking to a script rather than actually responding to what she was saying. The fact that he interrupted exactly 6 times in 10 minutes showed how calculated his approach was. This wasn't about real concern. It was a political stunt to create drama and get donations. Crockett knew all this because she'd prepared for it. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't just anyone. She was a human rights lawyer who'd spent years dealing with hostile situations. She was a public servant who'd won her seat by beating richer opponents. And she was a woman who'd been underestimated her whole life. As the room quieted down, Crockett looked straight at Cruz. She put down her prepared notes and spoke without them, her voice clear in the suddenly silent room. "Congressman Cruz," she said calmly, "I can tell you're really passionate about this. Since you seem to have so many concerns about my presentation, maybe you'd like to share your own evidence about voting rights in Texas." Cruz grinned his signature grin. This was exactly what he wanted, a chance to take over the hearing and push his own agenda. He started to reply, ready to launch into his 7th interruption. But what happened next changed everything. Cruz opened his mouth to say what he thought would be the knockout blow. "Representative, since you're talking about evidence, let me tell you about the real evidence of voter fraud and irregularities that justify the security measures you're attacking." But Crockett held up her hand and cut him off, her voice strong and clear. "Congressman Cruz, with all due respect, you've interrupted me 6 times in the last 10 minutes. I think it's time you learned what the word respect really means." The room went dead silent. Cruz's mouth hung open. He'd been interrupted himself, and the shock was written all over his face. Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. "You want to talk about evidence, Congressman? Let's talk about evidence. You've mentioned ballot security 6 separate times in your interruptions. So, let me ask you directly. Can you provide this committee with evidence of voter fraud in Texas that would justify the voting location closures I was looking into?" Cruz tried to regain his composure. "Representative, there are documented cases of irregularities that—" Crockett cut him off again. "I asked for evidence, not talking points. Do you have specific data about voter fraud levels in Texas?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cruz, caught off guard by having his own tactics used against him, hesitated for a moment. "Well, the issue is more complicated than simple fraud numbers." "So that's a no," Crockett said calmly. "You don't have evidence of fraud that would justify closing voting sites in mainly minority areas. You interrupted my presentation 6 times to challenge evidence you haven't even examined, while offering no evidence of your own." The room was electric. Aides were scribbling notes. Journalists were leaning forward, trying to catch every word. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for without even knowing it. Crockett wasn't finished. Turning to face the whole panel, she spoke with newfound confidence. "Mr. Chair," she began, "I've spent the last 10 minutes dealing with constant interruptions from someone who claims to care about facts, but can't back up his own claims. Senator Cruz has made this about him instead of the important issue of voter rights." Cruz tried to jump in. "Point of order?" "No," Crockett said sharply, cutting him off. "Senator, you've had plenty of chances to make your points. Now it's time to listen." The tables had completely turned. Cruz, who'd been running the show, suddenly found himself on the defensive. His usual tactics, interruptions, pressure, playing technicalities, were now being used against him by someone who knew how to handle tough opponents. Crockett went back to her notes, But instead of continuing her speech, she directly addressed each of Cruz's interruptions. Senator Cruz questioned my legal references. I have the court rulings right here if he wants to see them. He questioned my research. I have reviewed studies from 3 universities. He questioned my description of voter pressure. I have signed statements from voters who experienced it. With each point, she placed documents on the desk with a satisfying thud. Real proof versus empty words. But what I don't have, Crockett continued, is any proof from Senator Cruz to support his claims about election fraud or the need for the restrictions he's defending. What I don't have is any actual plan from someone who spent more time interrupting than listening. Cruz was turning red. He tried one more time to regain control. Madam Chair, if you understood basic law, Crockett interrupted, her voice sharp. I practiced basic law before I got here. I fought voter rights cases in court while you were writing fundraising emails about them. So please don't lecture me on basic law when you can't even follow basic committee rules. The room erupted. Liberals were cheering, while conservatives sat in stunned silence. Even the chair looked impressed, despite trying to stay neutral. But Crockett had one more trick up her sleeve. She lifted a large binder from her desk and held it up for everyone to see. Since Senator Cruz is so concerned with facts, she said, let me share some facts with this panel. This binder contains election data from Senator Cruz's own re-election campaign in 2018. It shows that his campaign relied heavily on early voting, mail-in ballots, and extended voting hours, the very same voting methods he now claims are security risks. She opened the binder and started reading specific numbers. Senator Cruz received 287,000 early votes in one major county alone. His campaign sent mail-in ballot applications to senior citizen groups all over Texas. His staff worked to extend voting hours in areas where he had strong support. Cruz looked like he'd been hit by a truck. The hypocrisy was clear, using his own campaign data as proof. So, Senator Crockett said, snapping the binder shut, which is it? Were the voting methods that helped elect you to the Senate valid and secure, or are they the fraudulent security risks you claim they are today? The silence in the room was deafening. Cruz opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He'd been caught in a contradiction, using his own information, exposed by someone he'd tried to intimidate. He was embarrassed by his own game. Crockett put the binder down and looked directly at Cruz. Senator, you've interrupted me multiple times today, but your latest attempt proved my point better than any speech ever could. When politicians attack voter rights while relying on those same rights for their own elections, that's not basic law. That's political hypocrisy. The room exploded with cheers from the left. Even some conservatives looked uncomfortable with Cruz's exposure. The chair called for order, but the damage was done. Cruz sank back into his seat, his usual smile gone, replaced by the look of someone who'd just had their own strategy turned against them in the most public way possible. He tried to take down a new congresswoman and instead got taken apart by his own playbook. The fallout from Crockett's takedown was immediate. As the committee recessed, aides were already grabbing their phones. Clips of Cruz's embarrassment were going viral before the hearing had even officially ended. The speed of the online reaction was incredible, even for government standards today. Within a minute of Crockett's statement, people were already sharing her half a dozen opportunities line. Clips were going viral on all sorts of networks at the same time. Government social media folks watched it live and jumped on the chance to get it out there. Name-calling started instantly. Crockett destroys Cruz became a top trend, battling with 6 interruptions and respectful governance. Some tried to push back with headlines like Cruz fights back, but they were drowned out by the sheer amount of stuff about Crockett's moment. Political meme creators, pros and amateurs alike, were quick to pounce. The image of Cruz's shocked face became an instant meme, with captions ranging from serious political analysis to jokes. GIF makers pulled key moments from the video, making content that spread for weeks. The mainstream media wasn't far behind. News producers were already editing clips while the hearing was still going on, getting them ready for the evening news. Reporters were writing headlines and lead paragraphs, trying to capture the importance of what they'd seen while it was still breaking news. Within minutes, hashtags were trending. Crockett destroys Cruz shot to the top. 6 interruptions became a rallying cry for people fed up with political theater. The clip of Crockett saying, "Congressman, you've had your 6 opportunities," was being shared thousands of times a minute. The data from the online buzz showed interesting trends about how people engage with politics now. Younger folks, especially those under 35, were sharing clips with comments about a generational change in politics. Older people were more focused on the important policy questions Crockett raised. Women of all ages were especially excited to see a woman in office stand up to male aggression. People around the world started sharing the clips too, with political experts in other countries using the exchange to show both the problems and possible solutions in modern political discussions. Legislatures in other countries started looking into whether similar things were happening in their own governments. The media response was quick and harsh for Cruz. Experts who had watched his public appearances for years were calling this his worst loss ever. The contrast was clear. Cruz, the experienced lawyer, had been outmaneuvered by a freshman representative using just facts and her own knowledge. Progressive groups jumped on it right away. Voter rights groups were already editing ads featuring Crockett's moment. Fundraising emails went out within hours, using the exchange to push the need to protect voting access. Liberal campaign groups saw donations spike as supporters rallied around someone who had finally pushed back against Cruz's bullying tactics. But the impact went beyond just a bad day for Ted Cruz. The video became a lesson in how to handle political strong-arming. Law schools started using it as an example of good questioning techniques. Government training programs added it to their lessons on dealing with hostile questioning. Communication coaches looked at every part of Crockett's performance, from how she spoke to her body language. Students in political science classes across the country watched the clip, analyzing how Crockett kept her cool under pressure. Debate teams used it to teach members how to handle aggressive opponents who try to throw them off balance with interruptions and personal attacks. The video also became required viewing for women entering politics. Female candidates and their campaign managers looked at how Crockett refused to be intimidated by Cruz's old-school power plays. Her moment became a model for how to respond when male politicians try to use dominance and disruption as weapons. Professional development workshops for lawyers started adding the session to their training materials. Young lawyers learned from watching how Crockett turned a bad situation into a win, using preparation and facts to overcome procedural control and personal attacks. Young people in government all over the country reached out to Crockett's office, wanting to learn her strategies. Women in politics especially related to her performance, seeing it as proof that preparation and policy can beat bluster and bullying. Her staff started getting requests from government groups wanting to book her for training sessions and strategy meetings. Legislative staffers from both parties quietly started studying the methods she had used, realizing that the political landscape was changing. Old-school strong-arming and political trickery didn't work so well on a new crop of government folks. They grew up seeing all the political theater and knew how to play the game. That voter rights law? It got a real push after that meeting. Crockett just destroyed Cruz's arguments, showing how weak they were. Some undecided committee members were swayed by how she used facts. Cruz tried to do damage control. His people put out statements saying he was just laying the groundwork, and that the media was twisting things. But the video spoke for itself. You couldn't hide those disruptions and his total meltdown. The usual press tried to defend Cruz, but even his buddies seemed uneasy. Some conservative commentators even criticized his performance, saying he was unprepared and walked right into a trap. Those critiques from his own side probably hurt more than the attacks from progressives. Long term, Cruz's rep as this unbeatable debater took a major hit. People testifying later were way more ready for his tactics, knowing someone had turned his own game against him. Crockett, on the other hand, became instantly famous. She got tons of speaking requests from all over. Big news outlets wanted interviews. Government groups wanted her to speak. The clash really changed how committee hearings went. Other politicians started thinking twice about using those aggressive disruption tactics, knowing they might get the same treatment Cruz did. The video became a teaching tool in government classes. Students looked at how Crockett stayed calm under pressure, used Cruz's own info against him, and turned defensive moments into offensive opportunities. Voter rights supporters called it a turning point in the national conversation. For years, They'd seen politicians like Cruz control hearings with tricks and bullying. Crockett showed that being prepared, having facts, and using smart tactics could beat political theater. This also showed something about how younger people are changing government. Crockett represents a new generation of government folks who grew up watching all the political drama, know how to work social media, and aren't intimidated by the old power structures. Cruz's future in politics became a big question. Some people thought the clash ruined his image, especially with younger voters who see him as everything wrong with political talk. Others figured his base would rally around him, seeing the criticism as proof of media bias. But the numbers told a different story. Polls in Texas showed Cruz's approval ratings dropping, especially among college-educated suburban voters who watched the hearing. His fundraising slowed down, and potential primary challengers started hinting about running against him. The committee ended up passing the voter rights law, with some conservatives citing Crockett's proof as why they changed their votes. The bill went to the full legislature with way more support than anyone expected. It was a big win for voter rights supporters who had seen similar bills die in committee before. This time, Crockett's preparation and Cruz's overconfidence pushed the law forward. Committee members who were unsure were influenced not just by her proof, but by how professional she was compared to Cruz's circus. The strategy implications went way beyond that one law. Other voter rights measures that were stuck in other committees suddenly got a boost, as politicians became more willing to look at the proof instead of just dismissing it with political tricks. Crockett's presentation raised the whole game by forcing opponents to deal with facts instead of relying on political theater. State politicians across the country started talking about the hearing in their own debates about ballot access. For Crockett, it marked her arrival as a national political figure, but more than that, it established her as someone who could take on the most powerful political players and not just survive, but win. After that panel meeting, things changed. People took notice of her skill in tough situations. Her role shifted fast. Top Democrats started asking for her input on big stuff. Her staff got requests to train others on handling rough questioning. What started as just being on a panel turned into a masterclass in political fighting that others wanted to learn. Her fundraising went through the roof as small donors nationwide backed someone who stood up to Cruz's attacks. Groups that hadn't heard of her before suddenly wanted her to speak at their events. That moment turned a new congresswoman into a national political star. The story of those interruptions and one killer response became more than just a viral clip. It symbolized how being ready, sticking to your principles, and having guts could beat political bullying. It showed that old tactics of force and control don't work against someone who stands their ground and fights back with facts. The effects on political talk were big and lasting. For years, panel meetings had become circuses where the loudest, most aggressive voices took over. Real policy talks were often ruined by politicians who knew that viral moments were worth more than actually doing their jobs. Crockett's performance offered a different approach. Here, being prepared trumped showmanship. Facts mattered more than sound bites. Polite but firm resistance could overcome bullying. Political experts started studying the meeting as an example of how serious discussions could be improved by skilled people who knew the rules and the risks. The impact on future panel meetings was clear. Politicians who had relied on Cruz-style tactics found themselves facing opponents who'd studied Crockett's methods and were ready to push back. The dynamic shifted from aggressive questioners badgering nervous witnesses to fairer exchanges where evidence and arguments mattered more than yelling. Training programs for legislative staff started including the meeting in their lessons. New lawmakers and their teams watched the exchange to learn how to handle tough questions while staying focused on the issues. Law schools put it in courses on advocacy, showing students how courtroom skills could work in politics. The worldwide response was also important. Democratic groups everywhere had struggled with similar problems. How to keep policy talk serious in a time of political division and media hype. Crockett's appearance became a case study in legislative systems in many countries, showing how individual politicians could make conversations better through being prepared and standing up for what's right. Researchers began looking into what they called the Crockett effect, how well-prepared, fact-based answers could change power dynamics in political settings. Communication experts studied everything about her appearance, from her speaking style to her use of evidence. They created frameworks that other officials could adapt. In the end, Ted Cruz learned a lesson that many political bullies have to learn eventually. There's always someone smarter, more prepared, and more principled ready to call you out. For Jasmine Crockett, it proved that sometimes the best defense is a perfectly executed offense. The meeting ended, but the impact kept spreading. Back in Texas, voters were seeing which politicians could handle the heat and which ones cracked when their own tactics were used against them. Political conversation didn't change overnight, but the groundwork was laid in that room. Future historians will see this meeting as a turning point, when a new group of politicians showed they wouldn't be scared by the old guard's methods. When being ready and sticking to your principles proved stronger than exaggeration and showmanship. The social impact reached beyond just politics. Businesses started using the meeting in leadership training, using it as a case study in staying calm under pressure while responding. The committee room quieted as Rep. Jasmine Crockett stood to present her evidence on voting rights violations. But Senator Ted Cruz had other plans. Almost as soon as she started, he interrupted her with a point of order. Everyone watched as Cruz, with his trademark smirk, prepared to take over the meeting. What happened next shocked everyone. Cruz probably thought he could run over the new congresswoman from Texas with his usual tactics. He cut her off 6 times in the first 10 minutes, each time more aggressively than the last. But Crockett was prepared. When Cruz tried to shut her down for the 7th time, her response stunned everyone and completely backfired on him. Before we get into this confrontation, hit the like button if you want to see more moments like this from the government, and subscribe so you don't miss any action from politics. Now let's see how a freshman rep from Texas took down one of the most experienced senators in D.C. The meeting was supposed to be routine. The Judiciary Committee had gathered to talk about new voting laws, and Crockett, on her first big committee assignment, was sharing research she'd gathered over months. Her outfit was perfect, her notes were in order, and her presentation was confident. She had practiced this presentation many times, but Ted Cruz had been watching from across the room, arms crossed, with that knowing look in his eyes. Cruz had made his career on moments like this, spotting young progressives and making an example of them for the cameras. At 53, Cruz had a reputation as a sharp legal mind, someone who could tear apart arguments with precision. Crockett was everything Cruz loved to target: young, passionate, and representing a district that had shifted from red to blue. At 33, she was exactly the kind of rising star that Cruz loved to oppose. She had been a civil rights lawyer before winning her seat, but committee hearings were different from courtrooms. This was Cruz's territory. As Crockett began her opening statement about voter suppression data, Cruz leaned forward. He had done this many times before. Wait for the right moment. Jump in with a procedural question. Break the speaker's rhythm and take control of the conversation. It was a trick that had worked on many progressive politicians over the years. The cameras were rolling. The room was full of staff, reporters, and advocacy groups. This was the kind of high-stakes situation that could make or break a career. Cruz knew it. Crockett knew it. Everyone in the room could feel the tension. Ted Cruz sat at the table like a hunter sizing up his prey. His fancy law degree was part of his image. His years as Texas Solicitor General gave him the kind of legal confidence that had intimidated many opponents. He had argued cases before the Supreme Court, written popular books, and run for president. In his mind, dealing with a first-term congresswoman should be easy. Cruz had built his political brand on moments like this. He was the constitutional conservative who could outmaneuver anyone, the legal expert who could find the weakness in any argument, the seasoned politician who knew how to use procedure to control the story. His supporters loved watching him take apart progressive arguments on TV, but what Cruz didn't fully realize was who he was up against. Jasmine Crockett didn't just stumble into Congress. She had spent years as a civil rights attorney, arguing cases in Texas courts, defending clients against some of the most powerful legal teams in the state. She had won cases that everyone said were impossible. Crockett had grown up in a Missouri city, earned her law degree from a Houston university, and spent years fighting voter suppression long before she ever considered running for office. She had faced hostile judges, aggressive lawyers, and courtrooms full of people who underestimated her because of her age and appearance. The stakes were high, The voting rights legislation they were discussing could affect millions of people. But more than that, this was about power. Cruz represented the old guard, the establishment politicians who had run these committees for years. Crockett represented a new generation of leaders who weren't going to be silenced or intimidated. 9 Image. The Voting Rights Bill aims to make early voting easier. The Voting Rights Bill aims to make early voting easier, increase monitoring at polling places, and stop people from intimidating voters. Cruz thought the bill was a federal government power grab. Crockett believed it was about protecting the right to vote, which is what keeps democracy going. Before the meeting, Cruz had said he was going to show everyone the radical plan behind the bill. He'd looked into Crockett, studied her background, and thought he'd found holes in her legal arguments. He thought this meeting was a chance to score points against Democrats. But Crockett wasn't unprepared. She'd studied Cruz's ways, watched him in action, and knew how he worked. She knew he'd try to cut her off, throw her off balance, and turn the meeting into a debate about the Constitution instead of the facts about voter suppression. The room was tense as both sides got ready for a fight. Cruz's people had told him where the Democrats might be weak. Crockett's team had answers ready for any attack. The media was there to catch every bit of the showdown. What no one expected was how personal it would get, and how fast Cruz's usual tricks would fail against someone who'd been preparing for this kind of fight for years. Crockett had barely started her first point when Cruz jumped in. "Point of order, Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice sharp. "I think the witness is wrong about the law she's quoting." It was a typical Cruz move, technically allowed, but clearly meant to mess with Crockett. She paused, looked right at Cruz, and said calmly, "Senator, if you let me finish, I think that will answer your questions." But Cruz wasn't done. He leaned into his microphone, smirking. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, getting it right matters here. We can't let wrong statements about the law go unchallenged, even if they help our side." The room was buzzing. Staffers looked up. Reporters leaned in. This was the kind of back and forth that goes viral. Crockett took a breath and kept going, talking about the number of polling places shutting down in Texas. She'd said 2 sentences when Cruz interrupted again. "Point of order," Cruz said, louder this time. "The data the Congresswoman is using seems to be missing some information. Are we going to decide on policies based on hand-picked numbers?" This time, people in the room started to murmur. Even some of Cruz's own party were looking uncomfortable. Cutting her off once could be seen as normal, but twice looked like he was harassing her. But Crockett stayed calm. "Senator Cruz, I'm glad you're interested in the data. I have all the details and sources if you'd like to look at them after I'm done." Her calmness seemed to frustrate Cruz. He thought she'd get upset, lose her train of thought, and give him a chance to take over. Instead, she was handling his interruptions like she'd done it a million times. Crockett went on to talk about voter intimidation, giving examples from recent elections. She was getting into a groove, her voice more confident with each point. The evidence she was showing was serious, showing clear patterns of targeting certain communities to keep them from voting. That's when Cruz interrupted a third time. "Mr. Chairman, I have to object to calling normal election security measures intimidation. That kind of language doesn't belong in a serious discussion." Now the room was getting awkward. 3 interruptions in 5 minutes was too much. Some members were looking at each other. The chairman looked like he was about to say something, but Cruz wasn't finished. As Crockett tried to show evidence about poll monitoring, he interrupted a 4th time. "Point of order. The Congresswoman seems to be mixing up poll watching, which is legal and needed, with voter intimidation, which is illegal. That's an important difference." Crockett's jaw tightened a little, but her voice stayed steady. "Senator, poll watching is legal. Poll intimidation isn't. The evidence I'm showing clearly shows the difference." The 5th interruption came as Crockett was talking about how the federal government oversees elections. "Mr. Chairman," Cruz said, his voice dripping with rudeness, "I think we need to explain the limits on federal power here. The Congresswoman seems to want the federal government to overstep its bounds and violate the rights of states. By now, the mood in the room had completely changed. What started as a policy meeting was turning into a